Basically, the whole point of the command menu was that it was simplifying the interface from adventure games that use text parsers. Every single thing that happens in a conversation with somebody changes the context of what's going on, and then figuring out how to use that knowledge to both progress the game in a linear direction and navigate the story, but also just trying interesting things to see what happens as a result of these changes is, to me, like the core aspect of what makes the command menu so powerful and so interesting.
Hello and welcome to the Mystery Gamedev Podcast, where we cross-examine the developers of mystery-themed video games and investigate the skills it takes to make one yourself. Today's guest is Joey Lopes, the director, writer, and composer of the upcoming mystery game Detective Instinct, Farewell, My Beloved. The game's demo was recently featured in Steam Next Fest, and the full game is set to release sometime later this year. So, Joey, my first question is, how have you been, and how has the game been coming along?
I'm doing great. No, thanks so much for having me. I'm super excited to be here. The game is going great. It's so funny when you set out to make a game. You usually, I think your expectations of when you'll be finished are always going to be a little bit more, I guess, ambitious, optimistic than what it actually ends up being. And we went into this project with a lot of intent on it not getting into scope creep and not becoming something that would be really difficult to finish over time. We had a very clear plan. We're still following that plan. It's going great. It's just, none of us are working on the game full time, so we have to work on it when we can. But no, everything's going exactly according to our plan. It's been going great, and I've been having a lot of fun making it.
That's awesome. Good to hear. For our listeners who maybe don't know your project, go ahead and take some time and explain what Detective Instinct is and why they should play it.
Yeah, sure. So Detective Instinct is a command select adventure game. I guess that would be the most technically correct genre. A lot of people would put it under the visual novel umbrella, but you could think of games similar in style to Ace Attorney. That's probably the most popular game in the genre. But the games that, especially the games that I think our gameplay style is most modeled after, would be Famicom Detective Club, which just recently had a new game with Emio the Smiling Man on Switch, which you may have heard of. And it's a mystery story, fundamentally, where you interact with a ton of different characters on this train setting, and you're playing as two students who are wrapped up in this kind of strange mystery where one of them encounters this woman on a train who goes missing, and nobody on the train seems to remember the woman ever existing. So throughout the course of the 3 days that you're on this train, you're studying abroad. You are investigating what happened to this woman, seeing what happened, trying to figure out if she was real, if she, was maybe just a dream, these kind of things. And throughout the course of the game, just talking to different characters, getting to know all the people on the train, getting to know, yourselves, the relationship between you and the other character in the game. Just going through that and hopefully telling a moving and interesting mystery story.
Yeah, I mean, the premise sounds interesting just on its own. And I found out about this game actually a few months back, but more recently I played through the Steam Next Fest demo that you guys put out. And it took me about 30 minutes to get through it, maybe a little bit less than that. But it was a good, solid introduction to the game. It had a couple of mysteries in there that basically, they weren't very complicated, but they introduced the game mechanics really well. Sort of as a tutorial sort of situation. And it takes place before they get on the train. So it sort of also serves as an introduction to the characters, and I thought that was really well done too.
Sure.
Now, as far as I understand it, I think this is the first video game project that you've worked on. Is that correct?
It's the first I guess proper project. I mean, me and the developers of this game. So it's fundamentally it's a 5-person team. It's myself as what you said, the writer, director, composer. We have 2 artists working on the project as the lead, pixel artists and 3D background artists. And those 2 people, Harry and Andrew, they're brothers actually. I met them a long time ago on message boards for mostly devoted to learning about pixel art and studying game pixel art and practicing techniques for pixel art. And all of these communities back in the late 2000s were very much in the sort of they were sort of like game dev incubators. A lot of the people that were in those communities back then would eventually go on to become independent game developers or working in similar fields. So we met back then, and we sort of reconnected over the pandemic, and a large group of us that used to be friendly in those message boards, reconnected, and we started working on a lot of projects together. So we've made a ton of game jam games. We did a couple of like just like pixel art collabs where they would make like a big scene, and then I would compose some music for it, and then we released that as like just a thing on Twitter or whatever. But we worked on projects together. This was the first project that it is a more longer form project, like a project that we wanted to release as like a proper game on Steam, and utilize the some of our common interests to try to create something a little bit more, well developed. But we've been working together for a very long time, so we learned our processes of working together and how to make something, and ultimately, resulted in this for where we would end up.
Okay, cool. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense too, because I know the first project you make, it can be really difficult. There's a lot of challenges that you don't really expect the first time around. Also not uncommon. Yeah. Not uncommon to make a lot of smaller projects to hopefully build up to that. So it's good that you were doing that too. How long ago did you start working on the project, and also how did you come up with the idea for it in the first place?
Yeah, so it surprises me whenever I think back to this, but I believe that we started in like February of 2022 now. So it's been about 3 years, a little over 3 years. And the initial idea for the project came from, I guess it came mostly from trying to think of something that would be feasible with the skill sets that we had together. And I had just recently played through the Famicom Detective Club remakes on Switch. It was probably like a couple of months before that I had played them. And I had been having this like tremendous light bulb moment when I played those, where I was seeing like the entire like lineage of this genre, because I had originally played Ace Attorney in like 2017 or whenever like the HD collection came out, and I loved the Ace Attorney trilogy so much, and I loved those games. And then once I finally was able to play Famicom Detective Club, because those games are properly localized. I mean, these are games from like the 80s that Nintendo made remakes of in like the 2020 or whatever it was. Playing those, it was like, oh, I see where Ace Attorney comes from. I see where this genre kind of started, and then I learned a lot more about it and became really just fascinated with the gameplay style. I'm just fascinated with the gameplay style and had a lot of thoughts about it. So when thinking about the kinds of games that we could make as a collective, really the majority of our skill sets were art. I'm obviously a composer, and I had studied film in college and studied storytelling, so I was very interested in really trying to write a proper story, and just looking at what this genre was capable of and what the strengths of this genre were. I thought it fit really well with the team strengths. So that's really where it came from, and I basically just like, almost as a gag, like I just said to them, like, listen, I'm going to write a story and we're going to make a game, and it's real, it's going to happen, I promise. And I assume that they forgot about that message and was like, yeah, sure he is. But I came back a week later with like a storytelling treatment. Here it is. There's the whole story in outline form, basically. And they're like, oh, this looks good. Let's make it. So it's funny because really like the overall structure of the story has not changed tremendously since that initial treatment. Like, there's been some big changes, but we basically had the blueprint right there. So that's kind of where it came from.
Yeah, nice. I would say from my experience and from other people's experience that I've talked to, 2 or 3 years is not uncommon for one of these types of games, even if it's just a straightforward detective story with not even that much gameplay necessarily. It can take a while just to straighten out what's the story and all of the different puzzles the players have to solve and things like that.
Yeah, there's all kinds of things that can make it take longer than you'd expect. But I mean, really for us, like I said, we had the blueprint. We kind of I was very intentional early on in the project of like figuring out exactly what we needed for it very early on, and then just kind of, it's just the job of making it at that point, right? So even though things have changed and we've iterated on concepts and iterated on puzzles and game design or whatever, ultimately like the only thing holding it back is getting it done. Just doing the work, and it's it takes a long time to do the work sometimes, and that's just what it is.
Yeah, in your case, it's also a team effort, so I don't know if you'll be able to totally answer this question, but what do you think takes the most time for a project like yours? Writing, art, all the different parts of it?
Well, at least in our experience, it's definitely art. And it's going to vary depending on the project, because, like, for example, I'm a composer and a writer, so that's the stuff that I can do myself. The art is not something I can do to any significant degree. So then it's bringing in other people to work on other aspects of the project, and not everybody has the same schedule, not everybody has the same capability of doing things like to the extent that I might be able to, right? So if I'm able to get my music done really quickly, like there's no guarantee that the artists are going to be able to get their stuff done really quickly, because they might have other projects, they might have other things that they're working on, they might have full-time jobs. I mean, I have a full-time job, right? So it ultimately comes down to the fact that games like this, even if you make a lot of it in using like the reusable assets, so like character sprites talking to the camera, basically. Even if you make a lot of it in that, there's going to be times where you want to cut to like a CG or like a proper like cinematic style shot, and those are going to need to be illustrations. Somebody's got to draw those illustrations. And in our case, like when I originally went through the game, I storyboarded like it's probably like over like 100 illustrations, and then we've slowly been trying to rein that in to make it more feasible, so that we're not looking at needing hundreds of illustrations for the game, because that just takes time. You know, art takes time, and to get it looking good and making sure the artist is satisfied with their own work, like it's not something that you can just blink and it's done. And you wouldn't want it to be. You want people to take their time and make sure that that the work is done well and that they're proud of it. So definitely in our experience, the art has been the biggest bottleneck, but for good reason, and it's coming out great. So none of us are too upset about it.
Yeah, I would imagine so, because all I see about the game is how much people love the artwork. It's a very detailed pixel art style that is reminiscent of, like, I would say 90s or 2000s anime.
Sure, yeah.
And it's really cool, because if you're looking at it, you might even think, wow, this game came out like years ago, but actually, or decades ago, I guess in that case, but you might think, you know, it's an anime picture I could easily see have been made in that time, and it's... I'll get into more in that in a second, but when we talk about the aesthetics of your game, but it is definitely one of the big selling points I've seen is just the detailed pixel art.
Yeah, definitely.
So at the very beginning of the game, for example, there's this opening scene where you see this man falling out of a window, and it's like, it's really a surprise, because you just see him walking down the street and then boom, and it's like animations, and it's a shocking way to intro to the story, and you have no idea what's going on. It's a nice hook to get people interested. And there's other cinematic moments where a character shows up and there's a nice camera pan showing them. So how do you handle the storyboarding of those cinematic moments and turning them into like an actual pixel art design?
Sure, yeah. So the CG design, I guess you could call it like a two-step process, basically. Like I said, I storyboarded a lot. Like I'm not an artist by any stretch, but having like made movies and been interested in film, like I can storyboard and give an artist an idea of like, this is the kind of shot composition I want, this is the angle that I think will make sense here, and get a sense for like the timing and all of that. So I storyboarded a tremendous amount of the game, and then from those storyboards we then work with an artist. So our main CG artist is Jetto. She's a tremendous artist whose work like I'm so unbelievably lucky to have her on this project. But she's the one who did like all of the proper illustrations for like that intro, like you said, and when we cut to some of those characters early in the demo. And based on my storyboards, we're working together with her to try to like refine them and get it to a point where it's feeling right and it feels cinematic and it feels like the kind of story that we want to tell. But yeah, that's basically all it is. I mean, the pixel art, like all of those are basically just digital illustrations that are downscaled to our resolution, right? And you see a lot of that in like early, it's probably more like DS games. You would see that a lot, like a lot of the like the Sing games, the like Hotel Dusk and Another Code, like their pixel art, and even Ace Attorney is downscaled illustrations for their pixel art. That's one of the big differences between our game, where we have those illustrations that are downscaled, but our pixel art is hand pixeled, so it's not like illustrations that have been downscaled and then turned into pixel art. Those are actually hand pixeled from the ground up in Aseprite or whatever, and that's just because our two lead artists, Harry and Andrew, like I said, we came from pixel art forums, so that's just like when we started this project, there wasn't a decision of like, should we make pixel art or not. It's just that's just what we do, you know. So it was always a guarantee that we were going to try to make like a nice juicy pixel art style with these big portraits, but then sprinkle in those downscale illustrations here and there to try to give the game just like a couple of different, it's almost like different art styles in one game a little bit, like where they fit together, but they have like different purposes and different use cases for depending on if the scene needs a little extra punctuation, then you give it one of those CGs, you know. But I don't know. I always liked that. I always liked when games would have these like multiple different art styles that they cut into, which is something you don't see as frequently anymore. Like so you might see it in like a 3D game where they have like portraits that come up for the talking, like I don't know, like Persona or whatever games like that. But I like when games can kind of vacillate between various art styles, both in the game and outside the game. Like I like when official art is sometimes like in a totally different style than the rest of the game, you know, because it creates this little mystery between like what the game's art style like technically actually is. So a lot of things in our game feel kind of deliberately anachronistic in that way. I feel like it almost feels kind of like a DS game, kind of feels like a game that could have been from the 90s, but it's also kind of feels like a game that's modern, that's widescreen, you know. So it's a little bit of everything.
Yeah, it's very interesting, and it sets it apart from a lot of other games for that reason. And that actually ties into my next question. And I was curious about this one because when I played the game, the first time, the demo, I mean, and you step outside, like, okay, the first scene, you're in the apartment or whatever, and the hotel, you're in the hotel. And after that, you leave and you see the road, and you're like, you see these police cars. And I'm like, up until that moment, I had thought that every background was like a photograph that you took. Because that's what I did for my game. I took photographs and filtered them. I thought, okay, he must have done the same. He went to some nice hotel, took some photographs. I see the police car, and I'm like, did he really position a police car in just the right angle? So it's sitting like halfway blocking the road. Like, okay, this has to be a 3D render. And it just blows my mind that it looks so good. How did you make that happen, especially combining that with the pixel art characters?
I think it's almost like it's a very common thing in anime, right? Where you have backgrounds that are rendered very, very realistically, even if they're painted. They tend to be fairly realistic backgrounds where you have then on top of that these very stylized anime characters. And there's just something about that works. Like so it never really concerned me when we decided like we wanted to use 3D renders because it was almost like a practical decision because Harry and Andrew are also very talented 3D artists, and some of them are working. They're working on like big indie games that you may have heard of or done like tons of fan projects and stuff. So they knew that they had like that skill set and that it would work well for something like this, where we want to be able to have the flexibility to put a camera anywhere, right? And that's just necessary for like. It would be way more difficult to try to draw all of those like backgrounds if you want to have a large variety of them, and that would make the development time just balloon to something ridiculous, right? So we knew it would work. It was just a matter of like figuring out the exact style that would blend the best with the pixel art and with the CG illustrations. So it was just a little bit of trial and error. We worked a lot with the lighting and trying to get the lighting to look cinematic and interesting, and doing like a little bit in the programming of the game. Like we don't have a ton of flexibility to color the sprites, but we have a little bit. So there's a little bit of that going on when, like, for example, when you walk outside, like all of the street lights are very warm street lights. So you want to color the characters a little bit warmer, so the pixel art looks a little bit more like it blends in with that environment than it would under like a fluorescent light, for example. Because most of the pixel art tends to be like fairly neutral colors. But depending on the lighting of the scene, we can adjust that slightly. So things like that made a big difference. But just a lot of iteration, basically. Just a lot of trying different things, trying different renders, putting them in the game, seeing the best way to downscale them so that it looks the best at our resolution. And ultimately, we're pretty happy with the result. I think there's some people that will always feel there's like a little bit of a disconnect there, especially with like some of like the littler pixel art that we put in the scene. But again, that's just stuff that I find endearing. I find it endearing in old games, and I find it endearing in ours. Like I just think it adds a little bit of that kind of like scrappy charm to the art style that you don't really see very often in games that go for something that's a little bit more tried and true and reliable. Like we wanted to try something weird. It's a little bit weird, but it's weird in a cool way, I think.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, there have been plenty of other games that I don't know how many exactly, but I know there are some mystery games like Zero Escape where they do the 3D backgrounds and sprites. Sure. So it works well in a lot of situations. So I think you're doing a good job there. Now, also, I kind of think I kind of suspect, based on the list of inspirations you told me about, that your cinematography direction is inspired by certain films that you might have watched or directors that you admire. Can you sort of talk about those inspirations for the game and that aspect of it?
Yeah, absolutely. I think around the time that I started developing the story for this, I was really, really going into Alfred Hitchcock's filmography, and like watching like everything. Like I'm a huge, huge Hitchcock fan. But beyond that, just I have a lot of fondness for just I guess American crime fiction of like the 20th century. So that'd be like 30s through 50s, and that includes your film noir period. So directors like Nicholas Ray. And just that whole era of Hollywood that is based so heavily on American crime fiction, a lot based on novels like Raymond Chandler novels or James Cain novels. So I'm really into old Hollywood cinema. So I think a lot of that comes out in the way that I think about the shot compositions and the kinds of ways that those movies worked. But I wouldn't say that it's like it's not like. There might be a couple of cases where I like looked at a shot from a movie and was like, I want to do that shot. But off the top of my head, I'm not sure if I did. Like a lot of it was just very instinctual from having watched a lot of movies and studied a lot of movies, and just trying to like do what feels right to me and what feels like it's kind of emulating that feel. But also synthesizing that with the style of game that we're making, right? Like it's this game doesn't quite feel like a film noir from the 40s or whatever, but there's a little bit of that in there merged with the Japanese adventure game aesthetics that we're familiar with. And I think the result of that is a little bit like different. I think a little bit weird. But yeah, that's really all it is.
Okay. Yeah. What do you find most interesting about the film noir sort of hard-boiled crime genre? Because I'm sort of a big Golden Age fan, locked room mystery, that kind of thing. What's your take on the more hard-boiled crime, where it's, well, what do you think about that? What inspires you to make your game about that genre as opposed to a different one?
I'm really interested in human drama. I think that's probably the number one thing that interests me in movies is stories about people and the way they behave in certain kinds of challenging situations. And I think that the fundamental aspect of that era of crime fiction is that it's all based on human drama. So you have these mysteries that are happening, and sometimes like a Raymond Chandler mystery can be super, super convoluted and crazy and really hard to follow what the mystery actually is. But fundamentally what you have is these characters that are really interesting, and these stories that can be very, very like, they sneak up on you and how moving they can be, and they're often about like lost love or people taking advantage of other people's love, and romance that went wrong. And I think that there's just so much material there that I don't feel like is. I guess it's not explored as much in modern movies as it was back then. Which is not to say that it's not explored at all in modern movies, but I think that back then that was the norm. It was the norm that movies were fundamentally about human drama. And the mystery is what facilitates that. So there's a mystery that's happening, but the mystery is ultimately facilitating all of this interpersonal relationship stuff that can be very interesting and very like difficult. It's not something that like you often don't come away from watching one of these Golden Age Hollywood movies, like a film noir film, with a 100% like I feel this is how I feel about this. It's super clear what the intent was about the emotional intent or whatever. Usually come away with it with complicated feelings about the characters, complicated feelings about what ultimately happened, and it keeps you thinking. It keeps you thinking about the situation. So that's ultimately what I think draws me to it, beyond just the filmmaking style. Obviously, like, Alfred Hitchcock was a stylistic master, and so many of the choices that he makes in his filmmaking are just interesting on their own. But ultimately, all of his movies have very, very strong characters with very, very strong relationships and interesting things going on there, and that really draws me into a story. That's the kind of story that I want to tell. It always has been.
That makes a lot of sense. As you said, that genre is about character relationships, more about rather than solving puzzles or whatever. So I totally understand where you're coming from. Mm-hmm. And I also have an appreciation for those old films. So I'll have to go check some of those out because I've not seen all of the ones you mentioned to me. So I'll take a look at those sometime.
Yeah, no, the thing that's so great about it is that it's an endless amount of stuff.
Yeah.
Like you'll never run out of great movies to watch from the Golden Age.
Which ones would you recommend as your, like, let's say top 3 that people should watch?
So I'd say that definitely, in terms of our game, one of the biggest inspirations on our game was the Alfred Hitchcock movie The Lady Vanishes, which our game borrows its premise a little bit from that film, which is, it's sort of a stock premise that existed in a lot of Hollywood movies, which is, again, this idea that somebody goes missing but only one person remembers the person ever existing. So there's this kind of like questioning about whether or not the person was real, or if the person that remembers this person is crazy or whatever. But the way The Lady Vanishes does it in particular is so clever and so entertaining and so interesting, and where the story goes is so unexpected. But it's a phenomenal film, and one that I really couldn't recommend enough. Beyond that, I mean, it's so hard to encapsulate just a handful. I can think of I think everybody should watch some Nicholas Ray movies, because in terms of human drama, there was nobody who mined the depths of humanity and some of the darkest impulses of humanity. So like something like In a Lonely Place, which has Humphrey Bogart and Gloria Graham in the lead roles. That's an incredible movie that is very emotionally challenging. I don't know that anything in that is specifically evoked in Detective Instinct, but no, I couldn't recommend a movie like that enough. But and then maybe like on another level, like getting a little bit later, maybe something like Billy Wilder or something like The Apartment. That's another movie that has like a little bit more light, but has some really, really dark moments. And just again, like great interpersonal drama, incredible performances. From Jack Lemmon and Shirley MacLaine. Like I said, it's endless. And certainly something like Double Indemnity, obviously that's another Billy Wilder movie. That's one of the more like standard, like classic noir films. And you can't go wrong there. So yeah, I mean, I could talk for days about it, but that's a good place to start.
Oh yeah, that's definitely a good list. So I'll definitely check those out at some point. Next, I want to talk about the game inspirations, because obviously your game is inspired by a certain subgenre of games in general. Mm-hmm. And just go ahead and talk about what games inspired your project.
Yeah, so like I mentioned Ace Attorney as sort of like that was my introduction to this genre. Obviously, Famicom Detective Club, people who have played Famicom Detective Club, they'll see a lot of that game's DNA in our game for the gameplay style, which is based on a command menu interface. And I have a lot of thoughts about the command menu interface in particular and why I decided to use it. We can talk about that later. But that's obviously a very huge inspiration. I've talked a lot about the inspiration of Sing's games, so Hotel Dusk and its sequel, Last Window. I think those games are the closest to evoking that sort of human drama like style in this subgenre. And I feel that our game, it's not exactly the same tone, but I feel a little bit like that game's Hotel Dusk and Last Window, both of them have a stylistic similarity to sort of what we're trying to do. So those are big ones. I would say probably like if we're going back really, really far, a little bit of the Portopia serial murder case. So that's obviously that's what kind of started this genre. That's Yuji Horii adventure game from way back in the early 80s. There's a little bit of that in there, and just personally speaking, like I think Yuji Horii is like the best game writer that ever, because I'm a huge Dragon Quest fan. I absolutely adore like the way that he approached storytelling in classic Dragon Quest games. So I'm always thinking about that when I'm like thinking about how we're writing this game. So even though that's like a Japanese RPG, like Japanese RPGs share so much DNA with command select adventure games. And a lot of that coming from the fact that Yuji Horii is responsible for both of that, both of the subgenres really. But there's so many things in common between Japanese role playing games and this genre of adventure game. So definitely a little bit of all that, I'd say.
Yeah, and that point is very interesting, because over the past year I've had to do a lot of research on the history of mystery games, and I love history in general, but yeah, sure. I love researching the history of mystery games, and during that I found out, as we both know just now, Yuji Horii made both Portopia Serial Murders and also Dragon Quest, which is like mind blown. I didn't realize
Yeah.
that. So
He's responsible for so much of the history of video games. It's really remarkable.
Yeah. And there's just so much in that history that, honestly, from looking at your game's X feed, you do a lot of posting there and on social media about the genre in general. It is actually really impressive how much you know about this genre. So I kind of wanted to ask some questions about it while I have you here. But to start this off, what makes you interested in it in the first place? These Japanese adventure games. What got you interested? Because a lot of people, when they talk about how they got interested in mystery games, they talk about what I call the big four visual novels, which are Ace Attorney, Danganronpa, Umineko, or Zero Escape. But these Japanese adventures predate that by like 10 or 20 years. So what got you interested in those? I'm curious.
I think so. It definitely started with playing Ace Attorney. Like I said, I think that was it. Ace Attorney was definitely the first like kind of light bulb moment for me I say this as not in a disparaging way, but like it didn't really like occur to me how much leverage you could get out of a game where the gameplay systems are not tremendously complicated but are so important to the experience, right? So like Ace Attorney's fundamental gameplay loop is about pointing out contradictions in witness testimony, right? And that one seed of an idea is what powers the entire franchise, and yet it is so powerful and so strong and so interesting that like you could form any story around that one concept and it will work, but it wouldn't work if it wasn't a game. So it's important that it's a video game in a extremely like fundamental sense, but it's not something that's like tremendously complicated gameplay mechanics and systems and everything. And that was really interesting to me as somebody who's interested in narrative and wanting to explore like different narrative ideas. And seeing that in Ace Attorney was kind of interesting because I had come from playing a lot of Japanese role-playing games, which also have like very complicated narratives, but on top of that, very, very complicated gameplay systems. And I think the thing that appealed to me about playing Ace Attorney was that I was like, well, now we're very focused. You know, the narrative can take more of a focus as something that's really driving the experience, but the gameplay is something that's helping make that narrative more interesting and more compelling and more satisfactory. So that was definitely the first thing. And then when I went back and started playing some of these older games in the genre, like Famicom Detective Club, I started to see like the infinite possibilities that you could do with making games that are fundamentally about conversations with people. And that was basically what Yuji Horii had done with Portopia. Like that was like the seed of the idea, as he thought it would be interesting to make a game that progresses through having conversations with the computer, right? And the thing that I thought was interesting about Famicom Detective Club is that the command menu is so flexible. You know, it's not something that can do just one thing. It can do a couple of different things. And while sometimes what it's doing can be a little bit more obtuse than something like Ace Attorney, which is very clear, like you have a very clear objective in Ace Attorney, the way that you can use the command menu to explore characters is so interesting and so like so endlessly like explorable with different kinds of ideas. So that's what like it got me interested in trying to make a game like this, because once I had played those games and had seen some of the incredibly varied scenarios that they were able to mine out of the idea of having a person in front of you talking to them and just a handful of commands on the left side of the screen, like there's so many different ways to portray characters just through the interaction of those things that like it seemed to me like just such an endless well of possibilities for narrative and exploring characters. So that's what ultimately interested me in the genre, and that's what got me like super excited about learning more about the history of it and seeing how that ultimately would influence the entirety of games, and especially Japanese role-playing games, which they take so many like cues from this genre and the things that it did first.
Yeah, definitely. Now, as far as Ace Attorney goes, they, like you said, they simplified it down to where basically that command interface is part of the investigation sections primarily.
Sure. Yeah.
Where you move from place to place, you can choose whether or not to present information to different characters, and that also was sort of a light bulb moment when I was researching. It was like, whoa, this thing that's been in Ace Attorney this whole time actually came from these games like 10 or 20 years before it.
Yeah,
and,
absolutely.
Yeah, and so you could argue there's a lot of untapped potential with going back to that and revisiting that in different ways. What do you see as the biggest benefit of this command system? And also, could you just explain what that is for people who aren't aware of how that works?
Yeah, sure. So the command menu is... the easiest way to describe it is like, so when you get into a battle in a JRPG, right, like in Dragon Quest or something, you have a list of commands, you have a list of things on the bottom of the screen, attack, heal, whatever. Now imagine if those things were, instead of things that brought up other menus to use certain attacks or whatever, they were commands like talk, or commands like check, or commands like think, right? Like all of these things that are not about fighting, but are about having a conversation with somebody, or just using your own thoughts or whatever. You have these commands that are available to you. That basically the whole point of the command menu is that it was simplifying the interface from adventure games that use text parsers, right? So with text parsers, you would have to type in commands like talk to whoever, right? And Yuji Horii, when developing his second adventure game, the Hokkaido serial number case, he decided to do away with this system and replace that with commands that just existed on the side of the screen, because he found that text parsers could sometimes be very difficult to know what to say or what to do, and you would try certain things that wouldn't work, but it's because it's looking for something super specific that, like, you might be saying the thing that is like 90% of the way there, but it's just slightly off, so it wouldn't work, right? So he came up with this idea of having just all the commands on the well, I guess in this case it would be the right side of the screen in the Japanese games, but just all the commands that are available to you in the scene, you can just select from a menu, right? And there are some challenges with that change the way you interact with the game, but the thing that's interesting about it is that the way I think about it is, this is such a deep topic. I don't want to make it sound like I'm getting off topic here, but
no, you're good. It's interesting.
So think of it this way: let's say a game like Majora's Mask, right? Like Legend of Zelda Majora's Mask, right? In that game, there are a lot of interactions you can have with the NPCs that change depending on what's happening, right? So like in that game, obviously you have the time system, right? So like if you talk to a certain person at 1 p.m., they might say something different to you if you talk to them at midnight. But the actual action of interacting with them is not different. You're just pressing the A button when it says talk on the screen. But everything around you is different, and naturally, because of that, the person's going to say something different, depending on what's going on in their day or what's going on in the context of the game, right? And there are also things that you can do that will change what they say, right? So you could put a mask on or something, and then they might say something different depending on what mask you're wearing, right? Those kinds of interactions are always very interesting to people when they play these games, because some of them are very hard to find, or like very unique, or very like just things that they wouldn't expect would result in a unique scenario, because it's something that normally when they do it, it gives them one reaction, but it doesn't always give them that reaction, right? So depending on what the context is, the things that the NPCs will do or say to you change, right? Now, most games don't really work that way. Like an example that I gave in another interview is I was watching a friend of mine who's a Pokemon speedrunner. He was playing Pokemon Heart Gold, and he was just like streaming his game feed. He was just kind of relaxing. And there's a part in that game where you have to go to one of the Team Rocket hideouts in a disguise as a Rocket Grunt, right? But the place where you get the disguise is like a couple of doors down from where the hideout is. So you put the disguise on, and then you have the ability to walk around the city while wearing that disguise before you actually go to the hideout, right? So we were just curious, like, well, I wonder what happens if you, like, talk to people while you're wearing this disguise, right? Like, you look like one of the bad guys now. Like, what would happen if you walked into, like, Bill's house or something and talked to Bill? Like, what would he say? Like, shouldn't he be, like, freaked out that there's an evil person in his house? But, like, of course, nothing changes, right? Like, you talk to Bill, it doesn't even make a difference. Like, the game is not designed to react to things like that, even though logically, if you think about it, it should, right? And I think that most people expect games to work that way, because most games are not about those changes in context or those little details. But command select adventure games are 100% about that, and turns that into the main gameplay mechanic, where like every single thing that happens in a conversation with somebody changes the context of what's going on. So even if you have just like a very small list of commands that don't change, or change very subtly, or don't change a lot, like if you just a stupid example that I always think about is like, if you're in the middle of a conversation with somebody, and the weather outside is super nice, right? And you ask them about the weather, they would say like, oh yeah, the weather looks great. But then if it starts raining, if you ask them about the weather again, you wouldn't expect them to say the weather looks great, right? You'd expect them to say it's raining outside, right? So literally everything that happens in these command select adventure games is a change in context. So even if your commands don't change, what's going on around you does. So the gameplay is figuring out when those things have changed and then intuiting what that might mean for the commands you have available to you and how that might change what the characters say to you. You know, it could be a character's mood has shifted, right? Like somebody is now like they're looking at you with like a sad expression on their face. So if you ask them about something, they won't talk. Like they don't feel like talking about it. But if you figure out a way to make them laugh, then you try asking them about that same thing again. Maybe they'll talk to you, right? So there's all of these little things you can do that are really interesting to me from a gameplay perspective, where the player can try to figure out like what has changed in the scene, what am I capable of doing, and what is the most logical way to use what I'm capable of doing to progress in the direction that I want to progress. So you have that as like the linear progression, but then you also have all this opportunity for like little details, right? Like in our game, for example, like this is like a super small thing, but like in our demo, like you go back to your hotel room after the investigation has like concluded, and Emma comes to your door and like knocks on the door and wants you to like go to the door, right? But before you go to the door, you have the opportunity to look around your room and just check various things in the room. So if you do that, like obviously you'll think about your bed or the TV. You'll have like a little comment about the bathroom or whatever. Then when you get to the door and Emma comes in, you still have the opportunity to check all those things in your room, but now you have a person in front of you. So if you look at the door to the bathroom when you have a person in front of you, she might say, "Oh, do you need to use the bathroom?" Right? Like, because now it's not like the same context. Everything is shifted, right? So intuiting that and being aware of that is what makes these games interesting. And then figuring out how to use that knowledge to both progress the game in a linear direction and navigate the story, but also just trying interesting things to see what happens as a result of these changes is, to me, like the core aspect of what makes the command menu so powerful and so interesting.
That was a really good way to put that. I'd never thought of it that way before, but describing it as like a context change, that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, it took me a while to realize that's what it was also.
Yeah.
But once everything clicked, it was like, oh man, I am so excited by the idea of making command menu games. There is so much potential here.
Oh yeah. So you describe it as a command menu game, and you've talked about this on social media as well. Sometimes these games have been referred to as visual novels. I think you prefer the term adventure game. So can you sort of describe the difference between the two? You kind of already have, but can you go a little bit into what the differences are between those?
Well, yeah, I mean, the difference is mostly a historical thing, and I think it's just a case of kind of like the way that the West became aware of this genre of game is different than obviously Japan, which has the whole history available to them. I mean, we only became aware of it through the games that were localized or the communities that were available on the internet that were talking about them, right? So what to me, what happened is that you had these command select adventure games in the 80s, and they were a very popular genre. Most of those games are not available to play in English and probably never will be. But it was an incredibly popular genre. And then at some point in the 90s, Chunsoft had this kind of innovation on the genre where they created what they called sound novels, which were games like Banshee's Last Cry and Otugurizu, I think, is the other one.
Yeah.
I'm not pronouncing it right, I'm sure. But those games are what started this idea of having, instead of having a command menu, we're going to simplify everything to just a handful of choices that the player makes throughout the narrative. And depending on what choices the player makes, it's going to result in branching paths, right? So their innovation was basically like stripping the idea of the adventure game down to its barest essentials and then using that to be able to create these games that have branching paths, right? That's the fundamental difference between the command select adventure and the sound novel, which the term sound novel was trademarked, right? So they couldn't use that, like other developers couldn't use that, but they could use the same gameplay style, and over time that became known as the visual novel, which I think was influenced very heavily by the developer Leaf and their PC visual novels. But those visual novels, like especially like in the late 90s and 2000s, developed really large followings on the Western internet because a lot of them had been like fan translated, I assume. And when a game like Ace Attorney comes out and starts to get popular in English, one of the first of these these command select adventures to get like, and Ace Attorney is like not totally a command select adventure, but it's in that lineage. Like one of the first games in that lineage to become really popular in the West, most would have resembled to the gaming community of the time those visual novels. So it gets grandfathered in and called a visual novel, right? So then we end up with this situation where like the majority of the West doesn't really know the history of where these terms came from and what the actual lineage of these games is. So you end up with, you know, any game that has like a character portrait talking to you gets called a visual novel because that's just what people thought, right? And I personally don't have like a tremendous amount of like animosity towards people that want to call these games visual novel. That's fine, like whatever. It's just a word, it's just a term, it's whatever. Mm-hmm. But I think that it's more useful to understand the actual history of where all this stuff comes from, because then you have a more like direct understanding of the lineage of where games are drawing their inspirations and where like all this started. So that's why I prefer to just call it an adventure game, because that's technically what it is. You know, that's more like what we're going for, and what our genre, the genre that inspired us, is more of those early, you know, command select adventures. But yeah, it's you know, people can call it whatever they want. If you want to call it a visual novel, that's cool. It's cool.
Yeah. At the end of the day, it's just different terminology for mostly describing something that's kind of the same thing but with a few differences. In that same vein, you know, this is a theory that I've sort of developed over the past year. I'm curious what your thoughts are on this, about the historical genealogy, I guess, in mystery games. I've noticed that, you know, as you described, you know, you had Portopia that sort of influenced both visual novels and Japanese adventure games. That turns into sound novels with Chunsoft, which that ultimately turned into what people mostly know as Umineko as a sound novel. Which is interesting because it was trademarked, but they called it that anyway. So whatever. They did it anyway. So because that's where I first heard the term sound novel. But and then you have Ace Attorney borrowing these things, and you see the genealogy of it that way in Japan. But also in the West, you also had what they called point and click adventure games. And the very beginning of that was, as far as I can understand so far, is 1980. There was a game called Mystery House.
Yes.
And that was actually developed by the people who would go on to make the Sierra games.
Yes, the Sierra
games,
which is
mind-blowing to think that, because on the one hand, on the Japanese side of things, you've got, okay, mystery game ultimately creates this whole visual novel genre, and that in Japan, and on the West, you've got a mystery game that ends up creating most of the point-and-click stuff. So your sort of mystery games sort of approach it from two different angles, the Western side and the Eastern Japanese side. And
well, really, the real starting point probably is Mystery House, because those games and the Sierra games are what inspired Yuji Horii to make Portopia in the first place. Okay. Yeah. So in a sense, the point and click adventure genre is the start of the idea of the command select. I mean, the original version of Portopia was a text parser game. Like it wasn't a command select game. It wasn't until Yuji Horii's second game that he innovated with the command select format, and then when they ported Portopia to the NES, they used the command select format because that made more sense for the platform. But yeah, it all goes back to those early Sierra games and Mystery House.
Yeah. Do you think, because there's obviously sort of a disconnect between the Japanese visual novel sort of went one way, and then the Western point and click adventures went a different way. Do you sort of see those as coming back at any point to maybe converge and revisit some of those ideas, or do you struggle with your own game combining these Western and Eastern ideas together?
I don't think so necessarily. I think it's very similar to the way that Western RPGs and Japanese RPGs developed in a slightly different direction. And it's ultimately like the differences are, you could call them somewhat superficial. I mean, I read an interview recently with the people that are making that Claire Obscure Expedition 33 game, where they summed up like what their impressions of the difference between like Western RPGs and Japanese RPGs are. And I have like my own personal opinions on it. I don't know that I totally agree with like the super generalization that they gave, but like that generalization, most people would probably say, yeah, I understand where they're coming from with that. I don't remember exactly what he said, and I don't want to put words in his mouth, but yeah, I think that it's okay that there's differences there, and I think it's interesting to look at those differences and see how those two genres developed in slightly different direction. I mean, the big difference is that I feel like the point and click genre focused a lot more on environmental puzzles and environmental puzzle solving than on the idea of conversations, right? So the big thing with Japanese adventure games is that they're all about like having a person in front of you and interacting with that person in front of you, basically. And that's true of the command select games, and that's true of visual novels. Whereas I think that the Western adventure games focused a lot more on you being in a situation in a room, and you got all these things you can do and all these things that solve problems. And definitely like Western adventure games tend to pull the camera pretty far back. You have a character that walks around the screen, and you can point at certain parts of the screen and have them move around and stuff. And it's not like there are Japanese adventure games that don't do that or don't have things that are like that. I mean, it's a very common example. Another Code, like right on the DS, is like it's not a point and click necessarily. You probably can control it that way, actually, since it was a DS game. I don't know if I ever did, but it's similar in that sense, though. There's definitely like there's counterexamples all around, I think. What I would like is for people to recognize that these are the same genre. I think would be the thing that would make me happy, is if people would look at a game like even a visual novel like Umineko, like you mentioned. Like if people would look at something like that and recognize that that's an adventure game, fundamentally it is. Like, yeah, it's a very far evolution of an adventure game, but that is sharing DNA with Monkey Island or whatever. Like it's all part of a similar thing, and I would hope that that people could recognize that and allow that to broaden their horizons with this genre and see it as more than just one or the other.
Yeah, well said. Okay, so I had a thought in my head as we talked about this. You made a point that human-computer interaction was one of the main, I guess, starting points of what started the genre in the first place for mystery adventures. With AI being a trending topic, have you thought about how that could be potentially used to enhance the system? Do you think, like you said, when you talk to a character at 1 o'clock in the afternoon, they might say something different than at midnight? Do you think, and depending on the context of the environment that they're in, now theoretically an AI could look at the context of the game, analyze it, and spit out a completely generated text prompt that the player can interact with. What do you think about the evolution of AI as it is right now and how that might impact it?
Well, I have complicated feelings about it on some level, because I know that a system similar to what these generative AI language models are doing is something that Yuji Horii kind of tried to build before he made Protopia. Like he was trying to create like a way to have a genuine conversation with a computer, right? And whether it's smoke and mirrors or not, the idea was that he wanted to be able to say something to a computer and have it say something back to him that made sense. And he realized the limitations of that at the time. He couldn't do it. So instead, he came up with this idea of telling a story through this kind of interaction between these characters. Like he was going to write characters and write dialogue for them and write things for them to say to you based on what you do to them, right? So I understand that there is some level of interest in that kind of technology at the core of this genre, but I don't personally have any interest in it. Like I don't think that there's a ton of interesting interactions that the computer will give you that will support a narrative. Like, yes, you can get something from a generative AI that will tell you something different and can look at the context, but it's unpredictable, and it's not something that is ultimately going to like be able to be used for something. Like, if you want to tell a story, then you have to tell the story. Like, it's coming from you. That's coming from your experiences, your desires. You're going to have to write the dialogue. And you would want that control. You want to be able to control what players see. You want to be able to control what players are able to do, and be able to give this experience that is going to be like true to the vision of the thing you're trying to create. And I just don't see I don't see a path forward for that with AI. And the funny thing is that they tried this with Protopia, right? Like they tried to demo like an AI thing with Protopia, and everybody was like, "What is this? This is like completely ridiculous. I have no idea what's going on here." It totally didn't work at all. Nobody everybody hated it. And like full disclosure, I haven't played the AI demo of Protopia, so I don't know how good it is. I mean, it could very well be that it was just like, AI is such a bad buzzword that everybody just hated it because of that. I have a feeling it's not very good. But generally speaking, like for my own interest, I'm interested in telling stories. I'm interested in narrative. I'm interested in the artistic process. I'm interested in artists giving me a experience that is true to them and true to what they are capable of doing in their own creative process. And I just don't see, personally, I don't see a path forward for that with most applications of generative AI. There may be an application of that is interesting in some other way, but for this particular genre and for storytelling, like if there's a good way to use it, I haven't seen it yet, okay. And I haven't thought of it personally.
Yeah, I mean, I think I generally agree that in my opinion, AI has its uses, but when you're talking about telling a specific story, if anyone can just, it's sort of a philosophical question. Like if anyone can just generate their own interpretation of the story, are they really reading the story? Mm-hmm. So I totally get what you're saying there. I've also not played the Portopia AI demo, so who knows what that went with. But generally speaking, also, do you think, because part of my job is to stay up to date on trends and current trends and things like that, I don't have as much time to look at the historical aspect of things, although I do enjoy it. Do you think that there's a lot of lessons that modern trendy games could learn from those older games that they're not utilizing as effectively as they could?
Well, I think that idea of context changing things is so unbelievably powerful. It's just the challenge is that when modern games do it, because there's so many systems and there's so much going on, it's really hard to get players to actually want to try things. Like I can think of a handful of examples in a game like Elden Ring, right? Like there's like a side quest with this one character, Bach. Is that his name? If I remember correctly. Yeah, but there's a thing you can do with that character that involves like a really obscure item, where if you drop that item in front of the character, it creates this really unique NPC interaction that's really very moving. It's a very like moving little story moment. But I can't imagine many players found that on their own. Like I'm sure that they found it on the internet when people started posting about it, but it's not something that most people would try because it's such an obscure and specific interaction. And the thing that's so interesting about the command select adventure games is that you have the amount of interactions you can do is so limited that you're encouraged to try as many things as possible, because like it's not like it's not like you have a million different things you can try and then one of those things has an interesting interaction. You have a very limited set of things you can do, and there's a good chance that one of them will do something interesting. So I think that's one of the challenges with modern games, is to try to include some of those kinds of things. But I would like to see a little bit more of like the obvious things, right? Like, if you put a mask on, then like talking to a character should say something different to you than normal. Like, those kinds of things I think are, and people love those kinds of things. Like those are the kinds of things that make people find games memorable, because they appreciate the attention to detail, which like in big games, those kinds of things are seen as attention to detail. Whereas in command select adventure games, that's literally like the core of the gameplay. But you can use a little bit of that kind of idea in modern games to try to just inject a little bit more mystery and intrigue, and that's why I think FromSoft's games do a little bit of that pretty well. Modern Dragon Quest doesn't do it as much as the classic Dragon Quest do, but classic Dragon Quest games are all about that, because that's like, again, Yuji Hoри's particular storytelling style is so much based on the way the player interacts with the game. But yeah, I mean, I would hope that people could see some of the stuff that these games are doing, and intuit that there's interesting ways to apply the lessons from those to modern games. I think a lot of people, though, like they look at some of these old command select games, and they rather than meeting them at what they're doing, they apply knowledge from the games that they've already played to them, and are a little bit confused by what's going on. So like if you play Ace Attorney and then go straight into Famicom Detective Club, like if you're just coming from the mindset of I want this to be exactly like Ace Attorney, you're going to be very confused about what's going on with these commands. But if you take the time to be like, okay, what does this game actually want from me? What is this game expecting from me? Then you can start to see that there's like a really intentional game design behind the things that the way this game is designed. But just being open-minded in that way can create so many like ideas in your head about things you could do in other genres. And I'm sure that is one of the things that really inspired Yuji Horii in making Dragon Quest in the first place, is that he had made all these adventure games, then he played wizardry and Ultima and these games. Like I want to try to make something like that, but I also have all this inspiration from adventure games and storytelling and manga. Let's synthesize these things into something new, right? So yeah, there's always so much inspiration to be gained from these early games, especially because so much of the game design over time has gotten simplified or outright like kind of changed in a way that makes it almost unrecognizable. That when you play a game like Famicom Detective Club for the first time, it feels very novel to us now because it's so different from the games that were inspired by it.
Mm-hmm. Now, if someone is totally new to these kinds of games and they want to sort of, try them out for the first time, theoretically they could go back and play the old versions of them, but a lot of them have been getting remakes recently. What are your thoughts? Do you think they should go back and play the old ones, or should they just go straight to the remakes? What do you think about those?
I have mixed feelings on remakes, as everybody does. I mean, like as somebody who's interested in the history of these games, I think that there's a lot of value in going back and playing the originals. I mean, like Famicom Detective Club Part 2, which was translated as The Girl Who Stands Behind in the remake, that has had a fan translation on the Super Nintendo version that the same person, Tomato, who did the Mother 3 translation, actually was a part of that translation team. One of their very early projects, I think. So that has existed for a while. You can play the Super Nintendo version. And the Super Nintendo version is wonderful. Like the pixel art is so nice, and the direction of the scenes is so interesting and well done. The remakes are faithful to it in a lot of ways, but the art style is very different. And obviously the music is different because you had the Super Nintendo, whatever that was capable of, but now you have a fully arranged score for like the remakes of these games. It's a matter of preference, it's a matter of personal taste. I would like, if you just want to get into these games, there's nothing wrong with playing the remakes. It's fine. You're gonna like if you really have an interest in it, then you might go back and play one of the originals anyway after having played the remake. Like I think that whatever gets you onboarded is fine by me, and I think the remakes are great. Like the Famicom Detective remakes are really like well done and really really thoughtfully replicate the game design of the original games. And like to like a very like significant degree. That's also true of the recent remake of the Hokkaido serial murder case, which is very, very faithful to the original game's design, and it has some extra stuff added to it. Like it has its own basically contains its own sequel almost. But the core of it that is the original game is basically to a T the original game with the original game's artist doing the art. So it feels like an evolution that's very true to the original, but. Yeah, again, if that works for you, then you'll want to go back and play those originals. You want to learn everything. I encourage people to be as well-rounded and as curious as possible. Like if the remake is the thing that gets you on, then keep digging deeper.
Yeah, it's a good way to put it. Getting back to your game specifically, I noticed that the Next Fest demo had a Japanese translation included.
Yep.
I assume, and you can tell me your thoughts, but I assume that's because you want it to be an authentic experience where, those old games were Japanese. Mm-hmm. You want to have your own Japanese translation because it'd be really cool. That's what I would do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
What was the process like for getting that translated?
Yeah, there's certainly an element of that. I think another part of it is that one of our artists lives in Japan.
Oh wow! Okay.
And he has some connections with people that do Japanese translation. So just naturally by having that connection, it opened up this opportunity for us to try to do it. Mm-hmm. And we like from very early on, we had designed the game in such a way from the programming side, our programmer Kasumi, designed the game in such a way that translation, like, not that we could foresee every problem that we would run into if we tried to translate the game, but like trying to design it in such a way that if we were to translate it, it would be doable and not like a major headache. Mm-hmm. I mean, there's going to be headaches regardless, and there certainly were. But nevertheless, we always intended for it to have the possibility to be translated. Japanese just happened to be the best opportunity for us because we had that connection with one of our artists. And because this is a genre that has its origins in Japan, it just is a natural fit for wanting to make a game like this that is playable in Japanese. So yeah, the process has been interesting. It's very scary from the perspective of somebody who can't speak Japanese because you write all these words and you have no way of knowing what the translated words are really evoking, right?
Right.
Like, because when you're writing like a script, you know, like I'll sometimes sit there looking at a line and like there's like one word that I'm like, do I include this word or do I cut this word out? You know, like the littlest details make such a difference to me. They might not make any difference to the player, but I feel like they make a difference. And I think like the tone of the dialogue can be so precise and so difficult to like get right and feel like you're getting it right. And when you're in translation, all that's out the window. You know, you have no way of 100% guaranteeing that the tone that you intended is 100% what's being, you know, expressed in this other language, especially a language like Japanese that is so different from English.
Yeah.
But in a way, I like that too, though, because it's good to kind of like take a step back and recognize, like, if you want this game to be played by as many people as possible in many different languages as possible, you have to let go a little bit of your own like preciousness about the stuff that you're making. And I try to be that way as a director of a game in general, right? Like I'm not trying to micromanage to a ridiculous degree because I just don't think that that's fun for anybody. Like, you know, have like a strong vision, but don't be like, you know, this pixel is totally wrong here. You know, like
one pixel off.
Yeah. And if there's ever any little things like that, I'll just go in and like make little adjustments myself anyway, because you know I come from a pixel art background a little bit myself. But like I don't believe in micromanaging your team. I think that's stupid. Like in terms of like the character designs, I gave them no direction at all. Basically, I said whatever you think these characters should look like, I'm happy with that. You know. And we didn't really iterate on the characters that much. Like we were very happy with it, and I think that's a much more collaborative process. So in a way, translation is a lot like that. It's collaboration. You're trusting another writer to like do justice to the words that you wrote, and their personality is going to come through in their translation, just naturally, and that's fine. That's great, and it should. And you know, I'm very excited to see what Japanese players think of the game when it's finally released.
Yeah, it's very interesting because it's kind of the opposite problem that we normally have, where you have all these untranslated Japanese games and you're relying on these fan translators to go and translate it correctly in English, and you're like, no, that's not the right translation, or they didn't get it right, or so you're having to experience it from the opposite end. That's kind of interesting.
Yeah.
On the topic of programming, I did want to touch on this since you did bring that up. What game engine are you using for your game?
It's a custom engine. It's built on top of SDL, and the big reason for that is like obviously we took a look at some things, like some of our artists actually have some experience in Unity. We obviously looked at something like Ren'Py, which is very popular for visual novels, but in terms of creating the specific workflow for a command select adventure game, Ren'Py is not designed for that. So if we were going to do that and try to use like an existing engine, it would have required a lot of reworking, a lot of changing. And like in hindsight, would that have been a better choice? Yes, no, it's very hard to say. But our programmer felt like, no, I can build this myself. I have an idea of what to do about this. Because when I came to him with like my overall thought process of how the game should be designed and what we should be capable of doing on the scripting side, because obviously this game is like super complicated programming on top of it, but then on top of that is our own scripting language for creating all of the events, right? And that had to be something that I was capable of working with, and like the other people on the team were capable of working with. So building that from the ground up just way easier than trying to retrofit something that already exists into a style that it wasn't really existing for. But yeah, it's interesting because this style of game is really not something that many people try to make, so there wasn't really a easy way to just jump right in and start making it. We had to actually think very hard about like what actually do we need to do to create the workflow to make this possible. And that was a really fun process. It was really fun, like breaking down the entire like kind of mechanics of how these games work into something like tangible that then we could parse into an actual custom engine. But yeah, no, it's an interesting process for sure.
Yeah, you don't really see custom engines too often for visual novels because of tools like Ren'Py, but
yeah,
as you said, your game's a little bit different, has that command select system, and I didn't think about it until we got ready for this interview, but yeah, there is no other real engine designed for that, because you on the opposite end, you've got those adventure game maker tools, and those are more for like point and clicks. So it's
right. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's a little bit of an in-between thing, right? Like it doesn't really have like an obvious thing. But that's why we thought, that's also why we thought it was cool to try to make one, just because nobody was doing it really. Like these games, I think, are starting to have a bit more of a moment, because like those Famicom Technical remakes were like the first big like of the classics that we never got that came back. And then, after that, we started getting a handful more of these kinds of adventure games. Like Paranormasight came out a little bit after we started developing our game. The Another Code remake came out, which I think was really interesting and really cool. And then, of course, you had the Hokkaido serial murder case, and then Emio, the Smiling Man, is the biggest one. It's like, it's insane that they made that. I still can't believe that game is real. But it's so cool. It's so awesome that it exists. But people are becoming so much more aware of this now than when we started developing this game, which has been so great. Like, it's been so fun to be there while these people are starting to become aware of these games and be able to talk about them on our social media and everything.
Yeah, definitely. It's how it feels for mystery games in general. There seems to be a bit of a, I don't know, renaissance maybe of these kinds of games just all across the board.
Yeah, definitely.
Now, you also, in addition to writing the story, you also have composed the soundtrack for it.
Yep.
Tell us a little bit about how you compose the songs.
Well, I probably consider myself a musician more than anything. It's definitely like I had played jazz in college and have been playing music for, it's almost 20 years at this point, playing guitar for a very long time. I always had an interest in composing and composing music for games. But the score for a large part of my motivation for making anything is the desire to write music for it, which I think is true of a lot of game developers, actually. Like a lot of the game developers that are also composers. Like the very funny quote from the creator of Stardew Valley, who like at one of his concerts he'd said something like, if you want to get your music out there, it's really very simple. Just create an entire video game from scratch. And there's some truth to that, though, because I think that video game music is like one of the biggest avenues for creativity in music in general, because there's so much flexibility in the kinds of music you can make for games, and because it loops indefinitely and there's so much music that's playing, like people get really endeared to the music that is in video games. So it's an incredibly creative space to be as somebody who's interested in composition. So for me, like a big part of wanting to make this game, beyond wanting to write an interesting story, was wanting to compose music for that interesting story. And yeah, it was fun. Like my personal interests as a composer, especially for this game, I didn't want it to sound like exactly like other games in the genre. Like there are some elements of like certain kinds of like chord sequences or certain things that are inspired by elements from this genre or just games in general. But I didn't want like the instrumentation to be like very synth heavy, which I think is very evocative, like Ace Attorney. I wanted it to have its own kind of feel, and like my biggest like musical inspiration, or where I come from as a musician, is like really 60s 70s rock music. Like I was a huge Beatles fan. There's tons of Beatles references in the game. Like this is a little thing, but that era of music that has like a lot of acoustic instruments, but it's driven by things like acoustic guitar and piano and like a little bit of electric guitar, but not like heavily distorted electric guitar. Like it'll be more like clean electric guitars or like slightly distorted electric guitars, but also like string sections and like some orchestral elements that are brought in. So I was very inspired by like that kind of like style of music that uses these acoustic instruments, but not in a way that's like the great Ace Attorney, for example, uses a lot of acoustic instruments to evoke like its time period, like the 1800s or whatever. Whereas our game is evoking something a little bit different and more like popular music styles that used these acoustic instruments like from the 60s and 70s and 80s and stuff before synths became like the main thing. So there's a lot of that. There's a lot of that. I play on a lot of the soundtrack. I play guitar on a lot of it. There's a ton of real performances from string players. Like we got some really talented players that I guess I became kind of acquainted with through making covers of video game music for a while. Like I was a little bit in that community for a while, so I became acquainted with a lot of the people that do these kinds of like freelance like performances for games. So there's a little bit of that in there. There's some really gorgeous live performances, and that's really what I wanted to express. I wanted to try to use as much like acoustic feeling instrumentation as possible. Something a little bit different from other games in the genre, I think.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. My personal favorite song from your soundtrack is the detective theme. That opening part is very catchy.
There's a funny story about that. I told this in in one of my YouTube videos. Detective Daltrey is a very silly character in a lot of ways. He comes off as somebody who like maybe knows what he's doing, but also comes off as very like kind of aloof and like. So there's a lot of silly elements to the way that he's portrayed. And originally, when I was like just putting in temporary music for the game, just like writing really simple tunes, I wrote a song that kind of accentuated those more like goofy aspects of his personality. It was like a 12-bar blues type thing that I think like sounded like not dopey, but kind of just like more a little bit more of a silly theme song, not like in a completely crazy direction, but almost like. I guess you could think of it as almost like a pastiche of like a cop theme or something, something that's a little bit more on the like ironic side. I guess maybe would be a way of putting it. And that was very early in development, and we only had like a handful of people test the game at that point. But I remember just one person said they didn't like Daltrey. And I was like, I can't be having that. That's not going to work. So I was trying to think of ways to make Daltrey come off better without changing the dialogue significantly, because I didn't think that anything needed to be changed there. I didn't think that his character was portrayed wrong, but I felt like there needed to be something done to like kind of soften those like more silly, aloof aspects of his personality that at least rubbed one person the wrong way. So I was like, well, what if I just gave him a theme song that was really cool? if every time he shows up, you have this cool theme song that comes on screen that people are happy to see him.
Yeah.
So I went back to the drawing board. I was like, all right, let's minor key harmony. We're going to use like electric piano and like a little bit of electric guitar. We're going to make it sound cool. We'll still have some elements of that like 70s cop type thing in there, but make it sound a little bit more dramatic and just like like cool bass line, like all these elements that would kind of give it a little bit more of a kick that would make people like think it's like a groovy and interesting song. And yeah, like as soon as I put that in there, I was like, oh yeah, this is so much better for him anyway. this totally like works. And I was really happy with how that came out. And we haven't had any like a significant amount of people say anything bad about Daltrey now, is that most people really love him. So I don't know if that's because of the music, but like I think that made a difference. So there's a lot of, it's funny how many little things like that happen when you're developing a game, and music especially is such a like emotional thing, and like the way that people feel about a game is so heavily informed by the music that's playing when they're experiencing various aspects of the story. So you got to be very cognizant of that. Like you can't take any tune for granted. You gotta be very aware of the tunes that you're using and how they might be affecting the way people are thinking about the story.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a very clever approach to fixing that problem using the music. And it is, video games are multimedia, so the music does play an important part. People forget that a lot of times, but the music is what you remember for sure.
Oh yeah, absolutely. It's super important. And I mean, that's like one of the things that got me into music in general was like, I mean, early on it would have been hearing stuff like Final Fantasy music and Nobuo Uematsu's music and stuff, and just like having never heard anything like that in my life from like popular music, like this is so beautiful and so evocative, like I want to make beautiful music, like that to me is, and video games are such a perfect place for that. So hopefully it works. I'm excited to be able to release the full game eventually and have people hear the full score.
Yeah. And you got into talking about this a bit earlier. You upload covers of music, video game music, and I noticed you also analyze video game music on YouTube. That's also very interesting. So tell me a little bit about how you started doing that.
Yeah, sure. I am very passionate about music theory and music education. And I started to develop that in college when I started to really like learn about music, because there was a period probably in high school, and this comes from being somebody who originally learned how to play music from a rock perspective, where there was probably a little part of me that thought like, I shouldn't learn music theory because that would be like, maybe taking the fun out of music or something like that. But realizing in college, once I started playing jazz, how incredibly wrong that mindset was has made me like a like I preach the value of music theory to everybody that I can who is a musician, because my appreciation of music, my ability to enjoy music, my ability to play music and create music just went so much further up when I started actually understanding music theory and being able to like listen to songs and understand what I was hearing and understand like, oh, I understand this chord progression. I can see what's happening here. I can see what's happening in the structure of the song. Like once that makes sense to you, like it makes all music interesting to listen to, because you can always have that, like, in addition to having the just wash over you experience, you can have a little bit of an analytical experience. And like that's something that really comes from like when you start playing jazz, especially, I feel like and your ear starts getting attuned to these more complicated things. Like, you know, you'll hear like somebody play a solo and they play a certain line that just makes you go, oh, that was crazy, that was so good. And like, but like you can only really have that experience if you understand like what the line is in context of like the rest of the music, right? So I'm always trying to get people to learn about music theory. I think it's one of the most beautiful things on the planet. And I initially, when I started making my YouTube channel, I wanted to just make covers. Like that was the thing that, like in high school, I was super into like the video game music cover scene that was very new at the time when I was in high school. And like I was very inspired by these guys that were creating these very complex and interesting arrangements of video game music. So it took me like a long time since that initial inspiration to actually feel like I had the skill set to do that and start making those covers. But I did eventually. And started uploading a little bit of those, and you know got a little bit of a following from a lot of those. But after a while, I was like, well, maybe I could try the video essay type thing. I could try talking about some of these soundtracks that inspire me and like why they inspire me, why I think they're cool. So I did a little bit of that. I had one video about some sound design, like and music type stuff in Super Mario Odyssey, way back in 2017. That was not popular. There was like an awards show. Like the DICE Awards, where Super Mario Odyssey ended up winning Best Sound Design, and the guy, I think Nate Bildorf, one of the Nintendo representatives, he got on stage and was like, yeah, you know, if you hear, you've seen a lot of people on the internet talking about like the power lines and like thing, and that's exactly what I was talking about in my video. And it was like only like a couple of weeks before that I'd uploaded that video, and it got like 500,000 views or something. So I was like, oh man, did I just win Nintendo an award? I mean, I don't want to, you know, it could have been anything. Like I don't want to take credit for that, but I think that it was really fun to talk about that, and people found it very interesting. It was like, oh, I guess I could talk about this kind of stuff. But I definitely put that on hold for a long time when I started making this game, because that was what I wanted to focus on. You know, I wanted to focus on the actual game development. It was only recently now that like most of the work that I'm doing on the game is more or less done. Like I'm constantly working on it, but like most of like the heavy lifting that I had to do is done. So I was like, all right, I'm going to go back to making some of these videos. And since I have like a little bit of a following anyway, this would be a great opportunity to introduce some people to the game anyway, right? Like, especially when I make videos about like Ace Attorney, which is a series that like people really love watching content for. Like, you know, people just like can't get enough Ace Attorney like analyses and stuff. When I make a video about Ace Attorney, like that's an audience that is very primed to be interested in what we're doing with the game. So you know, it's, you know, killing two birds with one stone. I get to talk about music that I like, and I get to, you know, talk about the game that I'm making. It's great.
Yeah. Your channel seems to be doing really well, so it's very impressive from what I've seen. And
I appreciate that.
I mean, do you think it's having a pretty significant impact on your game wish list so far?
It has helped. It definitely has helped. I don't know that I would recommend this strategy to everybody. It's hard, because if you're starting from zero with a YouTube channel, that is hard. Like, even me, like I have like 5,000 something subscribers, almost 6,000 subscribers, something like that. It's not a tremendous amount, but it's not nothing, right? But like when I release a video, there's no guarantee that video is going to do well. Like it could be a pretty good video, but like ultimately when you're reaching that level of person, you're at the mercy of the algorithm, right? And like if I had, you know, 50,000 subscribers, that might be different. Like I could release a video and feel pretty confident that it will do pretty well. Maybe not like pop off or you go crazy, but it will do all right. Whereas now when I release a video, it's like it could get 15,000 views, it could get 1,000 views. I have no way of knowing really, other than just like historically my Ace Attorney videos have performed the best, right? Whereas some of my other videos haven't performed as well. Like I had a Final Fantasy VII video that did pretty well. I made a Dragon Quest video that was a total flop. which is very sad for me as somebody who really loves Dragon Quest. But ultimately, like it's you're at the mercy of the algorithm. So if you're starting from nothing, that's really difficult, and it's also really difficult if you're just like for me, I'm not making videos about my game. I'm not making videos about game design. Like I would like to. I think that would be fun. But I'm making videos about video game music because that's what my audience is interested in, right? So me talking about my game is like basically just like a little advertisement, more or less, in the middle of these videos, and it's helpful. But it's if you're a game developer who's like, oh, I want to get the word out about my game. Maybe I should start a YouTube channel. Well, what's the content that you're making? What are the videos that you're making? What are you trying to do to get interest in your game? And if the idea is like devlogs or talking about game development, I don't know that that's a huge audience. Like I don't know that there's a huge audience for that, right? There's not necessarily a massive audience for video game music analysis, but there is an audience for it. I'm aware of that. Like I'm aware that there's an audience for that sort of thing. So for me, the strategy is making videos about something else that I have a really strong passion about, but then using the traffic that I get from those to try to help, boost a little bit of interest in my game, right? If you have that, if you have like a really strong passion and skill set to be able to make decent looking videos that would, play well to a large audience, then maybe it's something worth trying. If you have a YouTube channel already that you already have some subscribers from, it's certainly an interesting thing, and it has worked for us. Like we definitely have gotten a lot of attention just as a result of some of those videos that have done well. But yeah, it's not for everybody. Like it's definitely I think you got to make like content for the platform that you're making it on, right? And I don't think that like devlog content, unless you're like already really huge, has a massive audience. Like you can't start from nothing with that,
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Generally, from what I've seen of other YouTuber game devs, or really just YouTubers in general, it's about consistently putting out quality effort. And then I kind of imagine it as like each video you put out is just a roll of the dice, and maybe one of them will get picked up.
Yeah.
As long as you put out high quality stuff, you never know what might happen. So
exactly, and you got to be consistent with it. You can't get discouraged by a video that didn't do well, like because that's going to happen. Again, you're at the mercy of the algorithm. Sometimes it decides to show your video to a lot of people. Sometimes it doesn't, and it'll drive you crazy too, because like you might think like, oh, is it the thumbnail? Is it the thumbnail that's making people not watch the video? Maybe I should change the thumbnail, and then like maybe you change the thumbnail and it makes like a tiny change in the click-through rate, so then you think that you solved it. It's like, oh, now it's gonna do really well, but maybe it won't.
Mm-hmm.
Like it's that's the other problem with YouTube. You get obsessed with the analytics, and I wouldn't necessarily recommend that. If you have the self-control to avoid it and avoid getting like really like into the analytics and obsessed with it, then that's great. I don't personally have that self-control, unfortunately. So, I go way too deep into the rabbit hole.
Yeah. Well, you're certainly very busy, and you're doing a lot of things, right? You're writing the story, you're composing for the soundtrack, you're composing music outside of the game, and you're creating videos and doing the marketing posts on social media. Mm-hmm. You are just doing a lot of things. So my question is, how do you balance all of that alongside working a full-time job? How do you do all that?
I don't know, man. I just do it.
Yeah.
I think though all of those things are like I didn't know how to market a game when I started making this game. I didn't know how to put something up on Steam. I didn't know how to I didn't know how to do anything until I tried it, right? So I think that ultimately, like that job fell to me because who else is going to do it, right? Like, and so, but you can do anything if you learn how to like do it right. Like you join these communities, like these game dev marketing communities that will teach you like the ways that Steam kind of works. There's so many ways to like teach yourself how to like how to do these things, and also just thinking yourself like, what do you think would work well on social media? What do you think would like learning from other accounts that you've seen that have done well, and like trying to figure out your own niche, like all of that has factored into the stuff that I do on our social media account and like the way that we promote the game. But in terms of balance, like I mean, part of the reason that the game takes so long is because you really can't perfectly balance all that stuff, right? Like you're gonna have like moments where you're working on one thing and you're really inspired. Like there are times where I'm super inspired to write music, and I'll write tons of music in like a a week, and it'll be amazing, it'll be great, and then like one day after that, I'm just spent. I can't write any music at all. Like I'll pick up a guitar and I just have nothing. Like just nothing's coming out. I got nothing, And in that case, like maybe you dip back and you try something else, and then you try to work on, maybe you haven't posted on Twitter in a while. You haven't come up with some idea to try to like generate some interest. Maybe, for YouTube, like a large part of the YouTube channel for me was, especially the most recent videos, was trying to figure out a way to create a format that is not incredibly demanding from a technical perspective, but is still high quality and interesting and results in, good quality videos that are interesting for people. So that's why I'm not making like straight video essays. Like it's videos of me with a guitar talking to the camera with additional graphics, right? Because a video essay is a ton of work, like a tremendous amount of work, because you have to use so many sources of thing to try to like, there's varying degrees of quality of people that are making video essays, but like if you have yourself on a camera talking to the camera, that's a huge baseline of something to start with, and then anything you add on top of that to like spice it up a little bit, you can do that, but like at least at the end of the day, you always have something to fall back to, right? So that was the reason why I came up with this format, right? To try to balance it out, but it still ends up taking a really long time. Like if I decide to make a video, that's like a whole weekend that I'm obsessing over it, right? So when you're working on one thing, you can't totally devote yourself to another thing. Like it's really hard to just, and I don't think it's useful to try to do a million things at once anyway. You kind of lock in on whatever you're like inspired to do at the time, and then once that inspiration leaves you move on to the other thing, but also just always being aware, always being plugged into what's going on. I mean, like in terms of game dev marketing, I mean, you always have to be like being aware of what trends are floating around and what like things are going viral for people, and trying to figure out how you can fit into that and what you could do with your own social media, but balancing that with like not wanting to make your audience like exhausted with your posts is another thing that's really difficult. And I think that some people overestimate that a little bit, because at the end of the day, like when people are scrolling, Twitter or Blue Sky or whatever, they're just like, they see a post, they scroll past it. It doesn't bother them if they've seen it before, right? Like if we posted our trailer, like so many, like we have a handful of trailers that we kind of cycle through on social media. Sometimes they really pop off. Like just the other day, like we had a 2,000 like tweet or something, and it also did like almost 1,000 likes on Blue Sky, and that was a huge wish list boost. But it was just like one of those trends that floats around of for indie games, and a trailer that we posted 30 million times, right? So like it can work. It can work. Like you just have to be aware of what's going on, and like don't make a job out of it. Just like be aware of what's happening and make sure that whatever you're putting out there is solid and good and consistent. And don't fall off for too long because you think like, oh, nobody's going to like this post, or like, I'm not going to participate in this trend today because I don't like this one. This one is not to my taste. I'm not going to do it. Just do it. Like, who cares? Like it's social media. Like a post is a very fleeting thing, and you might as well like always be aware of what's going on and trying to keep people aware of your game. Because if you're not talking about it, then it basically doesn't exist. I mean, like, yes, there will be other people that maybe find it, maybe make a YouTube video here and there. Maybe, like, if you're a really, really big game, you might be able to just, like, survive totally on word of mouth from other people. But if you're at a lower level, or, like, a mid-level, whatever level you're at, you have to keep reminding people you exist. Because otherwise, like, they'll move on to the next thing. They'll move on to something else. And if you want to, keep generating interest and wish lists and everything, just keep posting, like, but don't sit there for hours trying to figure out what to post. You know what I mean? So hopefully that answers your question. I mean, it's such a complicated topic. Like when you're doing a lot of things, you really gotta like not worry too much about it. I guess like I don't think about it too much. I do what feels natural to me in the moment.
Yeah, I think that's a really good way of looking at it, and a great way to great answer to that question. It's just staying consistent and putting out good work and not worrying too much about it. I think that's really solid advice. So that actually leads right into my next question, because you talked about joining communities, being active and participating, and seeking advice and help from other people, seeing how they're doing things. That's exactly what we're doing at Mystery Gamedev. It's, as far as I'm aware, the first community actually targeting mystery game developers. I'd been making mystery games at least since 2010, we can say at least that much. So The whole time I've been doing this, I've not seen any real dedicated effort for that. I mean, you see different fan bases having their communities, but not necessarily one for just a general mystery game community. So I wanted to, of course, get your take on what you like most about what we're doing and what you think we could be improving on.
No, yeah, I was I first heard about you guys actually from another feedback response that we had gotten on our demo, where somebody had mentioned that they were from the community, and that's why I'm going to join your Discord. So I'm a Discord lurker. Like I don't, I'm not like somebody who is crazy in every single Discord that I'm in, but I pay attention to the stuff that you guys are doing, and I think that it's a really like vibrant community, and I would hope that people feel comfortable like going to other people that have made these kinds of games and feeling comfortable asking for advice about certain things. I think the way that you structure your Discord server is really strong, and there's a lot of like it's very clear. It's very, and you do a lot of events too, which I really like. Like I know you recently did like a mystery game jam. It might be still going on actually. I don't remember if it finished.
Right now it is. By the time this video is posted, it'll probably be over. But yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Sure. But I think that's great because those are the kinds of things that will get you to the point that you're ready to make a proper project, right? Like, I recently did a talk at the university that I work at about developing this game, and one of the main points that I wanted to make is that there's a big difference between the way I described it is there's a difference between making a game and making a product, right? Where making a game can be anything. It could be you making a game jam game with your friends. It could be you just experimenting with something in Unity and, using programmer art just to figure something out, whatever. That is something everybody should be doing. It's super fun. It's great. Make a fan game or something like that. Use assets from, games that you like, whatever, because that will teach you the fundamentals of game design. And that's the kind of stuff that I was doing in high school and throughout college, and then eventually like working with my friends on little projects here and there. And making those friends and making those connections that can fill in the blanks of the stuff that you're capable of doing, right? And making connections with people that want to work together. Like, I think this is something that a lot of indie game developers really struggle with, where like they come into wanting to make a game, like a really proper product that they're going to release on Steam with a, really, really like something that they're going to make money from, right? But they're a totally solo dev. They can't draw. They can't make music. They can program. They have an idea for the game design, but they run into this like big bottleneck where they want art and they want music and they want like all these things that they know games are supposed to have, but they don't know where to start with getting that sort of thing. And I think that that's a problem that I didn't encounter because I've been part of these communities for my whole life, right? Like I've been around these creative people and like working with these creative people for so long that we formed bonds and friendships and wanted to work together on stuff. So I didn't come to making a game without those connections, already existing. You want to have those connections at as early a point as possible so that when you're ready to make a product, when you're ready to make something that's like a proper project that you intend to sell and that you intend to, put a lot of effort into to make like something really, really substantial, you want to be ready. You want to have like all of the things that you need to make that possible. You don't want to have these blanks because no one wants to just make your game with you if they don't know who you are or whatever. Like I think that can be really challenging. So that's why these communities are so important. Like we need to have these communities of people that are interested in that have common interests in certain kinds of things. And in the case of something like the Mystery Gamedev server, I think that's great because you're going to have these people that are forming these connections, that are making friends with people that have different skill sets from them, that have similar inspirations. And those are the kinds of things that are going to support the ability to make these kinds of games and graduate from just making little projects to making like a proper product. And yeah, like I can't recommend that enough. Like to me, community is like one of the absolute most important elements because if you have all the skills to make a game entirely by yourself that is a really, really high quality product, and if there's some people that can do that, like it's very rare, but some people can do that. But at the end of the day, I don't think that's like, it's not a reasonable expectation of yourself. I think you should be capable of doing as much as possible and having like a little bit of knowledge in as many areas of game development as you can. But realistically, you're not going to have the ability to do everything. And I think the best way to be able to make a proper product, a proper game, is to have those connections with people that want to work together. And in just a totally natural way, you know? Like when you're talking with your friends and you get excited about something, like you're having a discussion about the possibilities of games and like, you know, wanting to make something together, like you want to be at the point where like, you know, you have those friends that are excited, but you also have the discipline and the knowledge to be able to follow through on that. So yeah, I can't recommend it enough, and I think it's great what you guys are doing.
Thanks. Yeah. Also, when you look back at the historical aspect of mystery authors, you know, they got together. They weren't necessarily doing things in isolation. They were doing it as they formed a detection club where they would share ideas with each other, collaborate on different things.
Sure.
Also, when you look at the history of the mystery games that we talked about earlier, a lot of these people were overlapping in different things. Whether it's as we mentioned, Portopia and Dragon Quest and that whole aspect of I mean that gets into Square Enix and
I mean Portopia was like and Dragon Quest were both like we talk about Yuji Horii as like the real brainchild, but Koichi Nakamura as the programmer was so unbelievably essential to those games' existence. Like he was a real master programmer. It was a collaborative effort. Like the history of those games is collaboration, really.
Yeah. So it's all about collaboration and helping each other out. So that's definitely what I aim to do with the community that we're building here. Now, generally speaking, let's say someone who hasn't made a game before is watching this. Maybe they wanted to join the community, or maybe they're already a part of Mystery Gamedev and they're watching this and they're thinking, I really want to make a mystery game, but I have zero experience. I have no idea what I'm doing. Now, you've been making your game for 3 years approximately at this point. It's almost done, almost ready to go. What advice would you give them to get started and help them out?
I think the advice I would give to anybody that wants to make a game, but definitely in this realm in particular, is just be very intentional about what you want to make. Like you have to think very specifically. Like the thing that people struggle with when they have like an idea for a game, I think, is that they don't hone in on exactly the thing they want to make. They iterate a lot early on in the process, and it gets away from them. They start to not really understand what the project is, and I think that's good for creativity. That's good for like something you should be doing to like, you know, learn a little bit. But like if you're setting out to make a product, especially at a low level, low budget level where you're just an independent developer, if you really want to finish it, you need to know exactly what you're making. You need to have a very, very clear vision in your head of exactly the thing that you're trying to do. So if you don't have that vision, but you want to make something, then that's when you go into the experimental phase, right? So you're going to experiment with writing a story. You're going to experiment with, you know, gameplay mechanics, play a lot of games, play a ton of games in this genre, take notes on how they work. Like that was really important for me in trying to understand how the game that we're making works, was taking notes on a lot of these games that inspired me. So like, you know, get a notepad out while you're playing Ace Attorney or whatever, and like get really, really into the nitty gritty about what's going on, like in the pacing of the dialogue, the pacing of the scenes, when the game asks you for something, like when the game asks you for a prompt, like those kinds of things. Like be very detailed, be very intentional about the way the game structures are working. And then once you have that, you'll start to form a greater understanding of the genre you're interested in, and a greater understanding of what you want to try to do in it. But it all comes from research and experimentation and coming up with ideas, and then eventually, like, if you do all of that, something will crystallize into an idea that you can see from beginning to end. And once you have that, then you're in a really good spot to start a project like this.
Yeah, totally agree, 100% on that. Now, for the final question, last but not least, where can our listeners go to find out more about your project, Detective Instinct, Farewell My Beloved, as well as just generally other links to find out what you're working on and support you?
Sure. So the main way to support us is by wishlisting the game on Steam. So you can find the game on Steam, Detective Instinct, Farewell My Beloved. Just search it and find a link to it. Our social media channels are pretty active, so we are active on both Twitter and Blue Sky. And our social media channels are used for more than just advertising the game. Like we try to like do a little bit of like you mentioned, like talking about the history of the genre and talking about games that inspire. I mean, really, like on some level, I treat our social media like my own social media. Like I try to keep it a little bit light sometimes, so it's not just game, but also like talking about the stuff that's inspiring me and inspiring us as the developers of the game, and giving some context for where all this comes from. So definitely, I would check us out there. And if you're interested in my YouTube channel, if the idea of video game music appeals to you and learning about video game music and game music analysis, or just music in general, like you could check out my YouTube channel. The tag for my YouTube channel will be Jalopes TL, so JALOPESTL. So you can check that out too. A little bit about the game. I might talk more about the game specifically on the YouTube channel closer to release. But yeah, if you're interested in music, that'd be a great place to follow us. But yeah, those are the main places. I would say, like, no matter what, like the number one way to support us, add us to your wish list on Steam. And I'm sure people are tired of hearing game developers tell them to wishlist their games, but it really is like the biggest thing. But it's also, while I say that, we're also planning on releasing on Nintendo Switch. So if we don't have like a store page on the Switch eShop yet, but if you want to get our game there, that's another avenue. That'll be great. But no matter what, adding us to your wish list on Steam is going to be really, really helpful for us in the long run.
Yeah, definitely. So that about wraps it up for today's podcast. Thank you so much for joining. It was a very interesting, fascinating conversation. We talked about a lot of things, and I hope it's been insightful for everyone listening. So I appreciate you sharing your time with us today.
Of course. Thanks so much, man. It was happy to be here.